Here is our host, Yan Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. We begin our show in Seoul, South Korea, where a senior American diplomat is on a visit on Wednesday. But the dispute between South Korea and Japan, both U.S. allies in East Asia, has overshadowed the visit. The row between those two countries worsened earlier this month when Tokyo tightened controls on tech-related exports to South Korea. Before we get down to our discussion, take a look at this backgrounder.
Two neighbors in East Asia in the middle of a trade row. A visiting U.S. diplomat on a mission to help fix the dispute. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs David Stilwell held several meetings with South Korean Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa and many other South Korean officials in Seoul on Wednesday. Souring ties between Tokyo and Seoul were on the top agenda.
I concretely explained our stance and still word fully understands the seriousness of this issue.
The truth is, no significant issue in this region can be resolved without cooperation between our two allies, Korea and Japan. So fundamentally, the ROK and Japan must resolve these sensitive matters, and we hope that resolution happens soon. The United States, as a close friend and an ally to both, will do what it can to support their efforts to resolve.
Earlier this month, Japan tightened restrictions on the export of 3 sensitive materials used in high-tech products to South Korea, claiming the illegal transfer of these materials to the DPRK. Japan has yet to show evidence to back its accusations. Seoul denied the allegation and filed a complaint at the World Trade Organization. South Korean President Moon Jae-in warned of tit-for-tat measures. Last week, South Korea's foreign minister asked the U.S. for help in a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Japanese and South Korean officials held working-level talks, but they failed to reach an agreement. Japan's share of the global market for those 3 chemicals is huge. It's very difficult for South Korea to either self-produce or find alternative suppliers, at least in the short term. The export controls directly hit the country's tech giants, which are big players in its economy. South Korea and Japan have been at odds over World War II forced labor.
So what are likely to be the repercussions of the trade dispute between Japan and South Korea? Let's loop in our panelists. We are joined in Seoul, South Korea by Myung-Koo Kang, who is an associate professor of political science at Baruch College in the City University of New York. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, we have Yoshikazu Kato, an adjunct associate professor of Asia Global Institute from the University of Hong Kong. He's originally from Japan. Of course, here with me in the Beijing studio, we have Rong Ying, the Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Go to you first. Mr. Kato, what do you make of the latest decision made by Tokyo? Will the United States be able to play a role to mediate?
Of course, Japanese government said this is security concerns. Some national security concerns in terms of managing our trade relation with South Korea. But, undoubtedly, some anti-Korean sentiment or very negative public opinions in Japan are prevailing right now and giving great pressure to Minister of Foreign Affairs. So now, I would say now Japanese diplomats or officials manage the relation with China somehow emotionally or sensitively. So I think, but now the problem is now Mr. Trump, the United States officials are reluctant to mediate or manage these very important allies in East Asia. So this is something like, vicious cycle. So this situation worries me very much.
Professor Kang, I understand that South Korea has already sued Japan in the WTO, but that could take quite some time. Meanwhile, the bilateral relations are deteriorating severely, as we have seen over just the past 2 weeks. What does it mean for South Korea? Is South Korea looking at the United States as a mediator at all now?
Right. South Korean government definitely wants some sort of U.S. government's role in terms of mediation. But as the previous commentator, Mr. Kato, pointed out, I mean, it's sorry to hear that the situation in Japan is getting worse. Likewise, in South Korea, Korean people's, some anger toward Japan is also escalating into a really bad. So at the moment, Korean government wants to get out of this kind of escalating crisis, but I think it'll be really tough, even for the United States, intervening in mediating current, conflict, because as you know well, Trump administration has retaliated China based on security reasons. So Huawei case was the one. So in a sense, the Japanese government is emulating the American government policy. In that context, it's not that easy for the Trump administration to get involved at this moment.
Of course, the issue about the national security has been overplayed, many believe, in the case about Trump administration approach to China in terms of trade issue. Now, before I get to our Chinese guest, may I come back to you once again, Mr. Kato? But for Japan, which is a country still embrace free trade, which is a country quite active in the CPTPP, for example, is the trade principle still important? Can unilaterally putting pressure on trade toward another country be the way that Japan would like to take from now on? Mr. Kato, your judgment here.
Japan had just hosted G20 summit.
Yes.
And Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, pointed out the importance of multilateralism and free and fair trade. And now, Shinzo Abe is trying to give a pressure, or even some unilaterally politically giving a pressure to South Korea bilaterally. So, this is some contradicted. So I think at least Japan should very carefully manage the relation with South Korea economically. Otherwise, your accountability, your leadership, previous efforts would be hardened. Very much so. I think now Japanese policy, including how to combine your bilateral relation with South Korea and your multilateral leadership, should be well combined. Otherwise, your consistency and accountability would be undermined. So this worries me very much again.
I see. Professor Kang, go to you. Of course, national security should also apply to the South Korea case. Now we understand South Korea has been talking about diversifying its sources for raw materials, whether it's compartment or components coming from Japan. So what does that mean? And will South Korea government now also use this quote-unquote the weapon of so-called national security to play up further in the dispute with Japan? The vicious cycle, it seems.
Right. First of all, from a longer-term point of view, South Korean government wants to diversify the sources of importing, those critical materials from Japan. In fact, Korean industrial structure has been heavily dependent upon the Japanese, components, especially the component industries. So that is a long-term solution. But at the moment, from the Korean government point of view, the Japanese government accusation that South Korean government violate controlling the sensitive material, etching gas, which is used for semiconductor, which might be exported or illegally transported to North Korea. So Prime Minister Shinzo Abe made such kind of political accusation, and in that sense, current Japanese economic sanctions or retaliation is motivated by political purposes. So that is real worry, and at the same time, it takes time to diversify the sources of import from Japan, because, for example, semiconductor-related two materials, right now the Japanese government tried to regulate more than 90% of material imported from Japan. Yes. So Korea's heavy dependence on the specific material makes it really vulnerable for the Korean semiconductor industry at the moment.
Yes, indeed. So there seems to be several layers of things. Mr. Rong, if I could comb through together with you what the two other gentlemen just illustrated, there is bilateral relations, there's history and trade issue, there's also other issues, for example, about what the U.S. role will be between the two allies. There's also, which I really want to ask you about, the North Korea issue, since that was being mentioned in some of the answers. Now, at this point, it is still a third-party issue. However, we understand another complicated issue involved here is next month, South Korea and the United States likely to have a joint exercise, a military exercise, and therefore Pyongyang took it offensively and suggesting if that were the case, the nuclear test could continue. Now, it seems that one thing involved with another thing, all entangled together in this region.
Indeed, I think this development is bringing a lot of factors in and to a kind of entangled thing. Which
And
I
it's
think
very fast.
And very fast indeed. I think first and foremost, I would say that this is very unfortunate and regrettable for the two economies, I mean, which are also close allies of the United States, to engage such a kind of trade dispute. And as far as the China is concerned, I think they are all very important neighbors and trading partners. China does not want to see. China hope that they would find a way to solve their problems, and that is the least China, as is Chinese and Americans are trade with. Regarding to the North Korea issue, the interesting thing, or if not interesting, I mean the thing is that North Korea, I think, as when the issue, the conflict, the trade broke up, North Korea, the official media also came up a very strong statement condemning Japanese sort of policy. It's kind of echo with the South Korea's sort of stance. And of course, to make the matter worse is that as we were just feel relaxed in some way that the situation coming down, now we have the new sort of sign of tension. And this is also because make the matter worse or complicated is that this dispute involves those sides actually are playing the card of North Korea, whether accusing or counter-accusing each other to I mean, of diverting that material to North Korea.
One of the things, Mr. Kato, one has to point out is that there has been a lack of concrete evidence, at least being shown to the public now from the Japanese side, of that accusation toward South Korea side, so-called exporting these materials legally or illegally to North Korea. Now, the South Korean side have said if there were evidence, South Korea would apologize. But if there were not evidence and was wrong accusation, Japan has to apologize to South Korea and also to make it known to the rest of the world. Now, Mr. Kato, what do you make of the current situation? Is there a way out if we can be constructive?
I think now, very regrettably, between two governments in Japan and South Korea, there are a lack of mutual trust and social conflicts in two societies. And actually, as you mentioned, some North Korea, some issues, illegally exported to North Korea. I mean, South Korea's chemical, components. Actually, Japanese government, very carefully denied. Japanese government has never said to that or something like that. But in these very sensitive issues, now two sides are lack of confidence and trust. So I think now I'm very very serious situation. Not only public opinions. This has been lasting for a long time. Social conflicts between two sides. But now the two governments. Previously, we have shared basic common interests and value systems, and both of them are allies of the United States. So we should face to the reality together. But now the governmental communication are lack of trust. So I think this is very much serious situation.
The issue there, and also it coupled with the fact, as you said, Professor Kang, that there has been an absence of the United States as a result of the U.S. own actions, and therefore would not be legitimate for it to be the mediator, whether it's about trade issue or it's about the peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. But Professor Kang, if we can be a little bit constructive, is there a starting point at least as to how things can resolve in a way to begin with, Professor?
Oh yeah, it's really difficult how to resolve the issue. But first of all, I think that we need to separate, entangle the complicated issues, one by one. So we'd better deal with so specific this, export regulation targeting semiconductor industry and mobile phone industry in South Korea, targeting Samsung Electronics and then Hynix, semiconductor company. So we'd better deal with that specific, a forced labor issue, and then after that we can deal with other related issues. I mean, so itemize and then each entangled issues,
yes.
and then discuss a diplomatic discussion negotiation will be necessary. By the way, going back to your previous question to Mr. Kato, I think in the Japanese context, I think we need to take into account two dimensions. One is the domestic politics, and the other one is international dimension in dealing with North Korea. In the Japanese domestic context, coming House of Councilors election is very critical,
yes.
because the coming election result will have significant impact of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and LDP's coming revision of the Constitution. So in that sense, North Korea, or Korea Basin can be a kind of rallying point, mobilizing domestic support base for the conservative, political groups in Japan.
Yeah.
Second is international dimension is that from the Japanese government point of view, ongoing engagement or any kind of deals between North Korea or United States or inter-Korean reconciliation, that will not be welcomed at all, because Japanese abductee issue has been excluded in this negotiation process. And in the Japanese context, Japanese people are still really worried about North Korean long-range missiles and nuclear weapons. So from the Japanese point of view, maintaining the status quo. Status quo means that division of the Korean Peninsula and then no substantive engagement between the United States and North Korea. They can be a critical interest for the Japanese government. So in that sense, Japanese government wanted to maintain a kind of ongoing, status quo. I think that those two dimensions need to be taken into account.
Great point. Let's have Mr. Kato to briefly respond to that. Mr. Kato, you've been nodding your head listening to your South Korean counterpart.
I agree with Professor Kong. Japan is a status quo power in this regard. So we hopefully, we could be, we can work together and maintain, the peace and basic prosperity in this region. So of course, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe wants to exercise more leadership and even visit Pyongyang and meet Kim Jong-un. This is Mr. Abe wants to do. But now, as Professor Kong pointed out, now Japan Prime Minister Abe is facing the election. So now, his action and behavior would be influenced by this politically, motivated situation. So that might be, some uncertainty for our negotiation with South Korea side.
I hate to do that, but I have to add another layer of complicated issue there. Mr. Rong, here in Beijing, the South Koreans already take the Japanese to the WTO. However, we all know that the appellate body of the WTO, which is the body for trade dispute, will not likely to have much power beginning from early next year as a result of lack of judges. The U.S. right now has been refusing to approve new judges as a result. So, which means there is no quote-unquote both recognized third party, internationally recognized also, that can be the mediator or can be the one that would be able to say fairly about trade issues. What does that say to you, and how is that going to complicate this very critical bilateral relation between South Korea and also Japan?
Well, indeed, I think both Japan and South Korea really have to sit down and talk about these issues, and by taking into account.
Because they're being left alone. All they can do now is to sit together face to face. There's no others that can help them anymore, right?
Exactly.
Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
You said it so diplomatically, sir.
Exactly. I think the two sides certainly should sit down, and by taking into account the overall situation that has been discussed, and the import, I think the sense and make sure that they have a clear idea of the sense of responsibility of the issues. And of course, as Japan, as the country that start this process, personally I feel that should take the initiative, if I can say. And the United States...
Is it because you've been working in Japan for several years and you knew how things could evolve over there in the culture?
It's nothing to do with culture. It's more to do with politics. Yeah, and the maturity of a country when facing up these questions.
But Mr. Kato just said it is the election season. You know what's going to happen during an election season, right, Mr. Rong?
The election will be certainly, will taking place very soon. So I only hope that after the election, there will be some kind of levels of talks, and so that the two sides can sit together
and
calm down. And but the first and the foremost thing, they should stop escalating the disputes.
Having said that, though, there's also the issue of history. Once again, I hate to do that, but there is another layer of it, which Japan, at least in some of the public debates, Professor Kang has been mentioning about that the South Korean court was asking the Japanese companies to further compensate those who were suffering during the Second World War, while the latter party believed they have already done it earlier. So, Professor, when history, very emotional issue, come into being now in this bilateral relations, once again, what does that mean for the South Korean administration to maneuver within the politics of the country?
Right. I mean, as you pointed out, emotional issue, and then this, forced labor issue in this Korean context is quite closely related to national identity and national pride,
yes.
Even the legitimacy issue of the Japanese colonial rule. So in that sense, it's really difficult to compromise. But at the same time, we need to look at the issue in a more practical way. The Supreme Court, made a kind of final decision. As you know well, South Korean democracy makes, checks and balance. So even the government cannot designate a certain Supreme Court decision at all. And the Supreme Court decision is basically 10 plaintiffs who served as the forced labor, and 10 people sued 2 companies, Mitsubishi and then Nippon Steel, these 2 companies. And then they asked compensation. And then the Supreme Court made a final decision that 1965 bilateral treaty that normalized the diplomatic ties between Japan and South Korea, it did not completely resolve the individual level compensation issue.
Sure.
And also, if we look at the Japanese context, at that time, those forced labor companies in Japan, they tried to compensate their own people, but they didn't do that. The Korean people at that time. So even we apply the law of the time, it's really unfair.
See?
So whether individual level compensation can be requested or not, that's the issue. And then Korean Supreme Court made a final decision. So it's very, complicated. But at the same time, this a forced labor issue is basically illegal from the Korean
I see.
Perspective.
Let me have...
so it's really difficult to retract such kind of final decision.
Absolutely.
Yes.
It's difficult. To Mr. Kato also. Now, as a Chinese, I understand what Professor Kang has been talking about. But if we talk about it, not just about the history, but rather to look at the history within the context of this discussion today. Now, it is also a very political issue inside Japan, because there was some Japanese consider it as quote-unquote history fatigue or things related to it. Whether that is correct or not, we'll leave it to another discussion. But what does that mean for the current administration who are willing to have the change to the pacifist constitution, obviously, but at the same time need to face all kinds of discussions within the country. So what does this current discussion with South Korea mean for the Abe administration? Mr. Kato.
Of course, what I can say here is, Japanese government's position is very clear, right? Any negotiation on compensation issue was finally and completely finished in 1965. But this is diplomatic context. This is only diplomatic. But socially and emotionally, our relationship should be moving on. So our efforts on promoting the mutual understanding and trust shouldn't be stopped at this moment. So now, diplomatically and governmentally speaking, this is done already. But the reality is here. a lot of Korean people are, anger and not satisfied with Japanese management. So, we need to face it, and we need to, promote and or establish some mechanism to, reconcile, these situations by joint efforts by two sides. This is what I can say here.
Well, that's already quite a lot, Mr. Kato. Obviously, you are making your voice heard here. Another important issue, I haven't got the chance to talk about it. Unfortunately, it's another layer of complicated issues. That is the role of the United States. Now, the U.S. has been ally of Japan and South Korea since the Second World War. However, the U.S. today might not necessarily be the U.S. 15 years ago. So how is your side, both from South Korea and Japan, looking at the role of the U.S. today? How much will the U.S. still be entrusted as someone that you can go to for a discussion about an ultimate value discussion and justice discussion? Professor Kang, go to you first.
Okay, U.S.-ROK alliance relationship very critical for the South Korean security and national prosperity. That's quite for sure. So many South Korean people genuinely believe in the value of the U.S.-ROK alliance. But at the same time, we need to take into account that many Korean people feel that after the end of World War II, United States treat Korea in general, in an unfair way, probably because of ignorance. As you know, San Francisco Peace Treaty that concluded the Pacific War in 1952, both Koreas were not invited, and our current, People's Republic of China's government was not invited at all. And then Russia, at the time, Soviet Union, participated and then withdrew. So the San Francisco Peace Treaty, it was absolutely incomplete in terms of concluding the Pacific War. But at the same time, as you know, Korean Peninsula got divided, not Japanese, divided. In Germany, got divided, but from the Korean people's historical way of thinking or mentality, we feel that Korea is the victim of the Pacific War, not Japan. And then it was made possible because U.S. strategies in dealing with Northeast Asia. So we need to take into account both aspects. So from the Korean government point of view, at the moment, U.S. proactive role in mediating or dissolving the conflict between Japan and South Korea is very critical. But at the same time, Korean people try to be cautious that always the United States put priority in terms of defending Japan first, and then South Korea is a relatively secondary kind of thing.
Okay, we have to wrap it up, but before we go, Mr. Rong, just to be fair, gave also you 30 seconds to talk. Go ahead, sir.
Well, indeed, I think we're talking about the very complicated issues involving history, involving geopolitics, and certainly around trade and issues. I think I only hope, as a close neighbor of Korea and Japan, China would like to hope that they would sort out their differences and taking into account the need for peace, stability, and more importantly, for prosperity.
Thank you very much, Rong Ying, and particularly our appreciation to our two guests coming from South Korea and Japan, Mr. Yoshikatsu Kato and Mr. Yong Koo Kang. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us.